Thank you, Ambassador Butani. Dr. Gupta, thank you also for this kind introduction. Just by way of slight clarification, while I'm very proud to having done what's on that paper, my only function presently is Foreign Minister. Everything else I've retired from, at least for the time being. So there's no, the only people who are responsible for what I say or don't say, the Egyptian government. I don't want to burden Monterey or anybody else with these comments. That being said, let me start off by saying this is only my second visit to India ever. First time I had to ask a favor of the Foreign Minister to send me up here because I'd never been. I was working as an advisor at the time, and I took advantage of your deputy in Cairo who raised the issue of why we didn't have enough consultations. And I walked into the minister and I said, well, they're complaining. And wiggled my way into getting asked to go and spend the day here, and I came for 20 hours. The only other way I could come is to get appointed foreign minister, so I had to find that angle and accept this position so I could come back and visit you. But I'm proud, honored, very happy to be here for a lot of professional and personal reasons. Let me try to address the issues at hand, what's happening back home in Egypt, and how it affects our foreign policy and the way your interests. And I'm going to do that in a hopefully concise fashion, but a rather informal fashion. If you really want to interrupt me, go ahead. If you can remember the question after I finish, just give me a few minutes. I will try not to be too long, although coming from an Arab background, working at the UN, there tends to be lag time in our presentations. But what I promise you is that you're going to get an honest opinion. Whether you like it or not is completely up to you, but I'm going to be very honest with you. Let me talk about Egypt with three basic parameters. What, why, and where. What happened? Why did it happen? And where are we going? And then I'll get into the foreign policy issues. Let me actually start by why did it happen? Why did it happen in Egypt? Why did it happen in Tunis? Why did it happen in Yemen? What's happening in Libya? What's happening in Syria? The winds of change throughout the Arab world, which are different, even in the cases I gave, but still exist. And what's happening in the future. Three reasons. Demographic nature of our population. These populations are very, very young. A quarter of the Middle East, by the way, lives in Egypt. And 56% of them are 25 years or younger. If you go up to 30%, it gets into about 60, 62%. 30 years of age, excuse me. I see the youngsters in the back. They don't want continuity, they want change. So we were bound to change. Secondly, the free flow of information. Whether governments wanted to or didn't want to, the fact is information flows much more freely now than it did in the past. Therefore, our populations see what they have and what they don't have, see what others have, what they like, what they don't like. And because they see it, they think about it, and they make their choices. Now, unless you give them, and both those two elements, by the way, are positive, constructive elements, not negative elements. If you give them avenues to express themselves and to respond to these aspirations and answer these questions, then the first two elements are positives rather than negatives. If you don't, and that's the third component, we had problems of bad governance. Each of the different Arab countries had different levels of governance, different levels of good and bad in the governance, but all of the ones I mentioned, for example, had problems of bad governance. Others also have problems, but they have a different package there. But anyway, so the youth bulge, information bad governance are what caused the changes that you've seen in the Middle East, what we call the Arab Spring. I hardly ever use that word because people tend to misuse it, frankly. I would consider it an Arab Spring in the sense that the Arab world is going to get better. I consider it an Arab Spring in that spring is actually a very turbulent season. You have the rains, you have the warmth, you have the cold. It's not something which goes in a stable fashion. And these kinds of changes can't be stable. I wouldn't consider it a spring, and the spring is, at least in our part of the world, is very, very short. And you can't have these transformations in a short period of time. That's really why it happened. I can add to it for the next 10 hours, conspiracy theory, which is replete and quite prolific in the Middle East. Part of it probably which is true, part of it which is not. But let me just talk about, between being a professional diplomat in the past and academic, I just want to stick to the facts, and we'll leave the theory to our publications. But seriously speaking, these are the three basic reasons that are common in all of these changes in the Arab world. Add to that, well, let's go into the what happened. And here I'll focus on the Egyptian case. Everybody's talking about removing former President Mubarak or removing the former President Morsi. This was not about changing government. It wasn't about changing president. In either case, what you saw in this case was, frankly, something that if we wrote it up in a fictional novel, you wouldn't buy it, because you wouldn't believe it. You had a population, twice, in 2.5 years, that publicly notified the authorities that on a date certain, January 25th in the first case, 2011, and June 30th in the second case, 2013, 2 and 3 months before it happened, they notified publicly those in power saying, on this date certain, and January 25th was police day, by the way. It shows you the audacity of the young kids at the time saying, we're going to actually demonstrate on police day. And we're going to show you what went wrong on police day. Details aside, for those demonstrating on January 25th and those in June 30th, there were two things in common. They were led by youth, joined by society afterwards, and they were both asking for the right to participate in determining their political future. The first case, asking former President Mubarak to change the constitution to ensure that there wasn't going to be a dynasty and you'd have free and fair elections. And in the second case, asking President Morsi for early elections because they were uncomfortable with the form of government and the constitution that he had established without participation from liberals. Exactly the same request. Exactly the same fashion, both public. And amazingly, the president didn't hear it in either case and didn't respond. So what ultimately happened was the military intervened in both those cases. I won't get into the debate about whether it's a coup or not because it's a waste of time. But these were, of course, exceptional circumstances. The really exceptional point in them wasn't that the military intervened. Militaries always intervene to ensure security of the state. What was exceptional was that the public went down twice publicly, announcing the date, venue, and reason for the demonstrations. In the first case, the military governed for 1.5 years and nobody called it a coup. In the second case, they governed for 3 days. And we had a debate about whether it's a coup or not. But let's leave that aside. The what I'm leading to is, this is not about a change of government or president. It is a country trying to define its political identity in the 21st century. The people trying to define who they are. And in our attempt between 2011 and 2013, it was the first time we had all of the stakeholders, all of the issues above the table. We did not in the past discuss the role of religion in politics. It was an issue of faith. It wasn't an issue of politics. Well, we've been discussing that since then. We did not discuss what the role of the military in a straightforward fashion. Our discussions about minority rights were in general principles and parameters in them. And I can go on and on about many different. We frankly had a discussion in the Constitution we just finished about the rights given to farmers and laborers, to give them additional support in Parliament, which were misused over the last 60 years. And then you had a false representation of people there, and this was creating a dysfunctional Parliament. So what was new over the last 2 years is Egyptians were finally discussing all these issues publicly. It wasn't, I'm talking to myself or those of my peers, and other stakeholders are not on the table. And frankly, that was the problem we faced in reverse last year, when if you weren't part of a certain political leaning, you couldn't get your opinions heard in any reasonable fashion. So my point to foreigners in particular, but even to Egyptians, we need to be patient, because this is much deeper than simply changing government or changing the president. It is changing how we act. You really want a problem in Egypt today? Be a boss. Egyptians are challenging authority in every level, be that private, public, government, or non-government, because they're trying to express their freedom. We're trying to find how we're going to do that in a fashion that provides utmost freedom, but provides order and normalcy in how you work at the same time. As part of trying to do this, we are trying to do essentially a number of things. One, create the institutions of a democratic government by drafting a constitution, which we just finished drafting 2 days ago, and which will be put to referendum within the next 3 to 4 weeks. Then holding elections for parliament and president. So we have representation of the people through an electoral process. As we do that, we are trying to ensure security, start up the economy, and create political reconciliation all at the same time. The real challenge we have is not only all of that. It is that in our 2 revolutions, it was a revolution without a head. In other words, there was no major leader who was the head of the first revolution or the head of the second revolution. There wasn't, I mean, I say this with admiration, there wasn't a Mandela where you could say, well, these are difficult decisions, let's take the judgment of the wise man. It didn't exist. This was a popular revolution in both cases. So you have a people that are adamant about expressing themselves, and rightly so. A system of government that has always been centralized and has never really dealt with all of these issues publicly at the same time. Even in its best of times, it never dealt with all of the issues at the same time. And you have a population that now aspires for so much, so quickly, that you need to achieve all this in a very short period of time, when, in actual fact, even the Middle East, which is if you want, the region where you've seen most frequent miracles, they're not that frequent these days. How we can do this in a short period of time is really a major challenge. So my point to my friends back home and abroad is, this is a fundamental transformation of a society. It's not only about the system of government. It's about how do you talk to the elders in the small towns, how you deal with your senior uncle in the family, what level, how you deal with your older brother. It's about all of that, how you keep that respect at the same time. Don't feel that you're subdued by an opinion that is different by others. That's really what's happening in Egypt. And one of the reasons why I've frankly been so appreciative of how India has responded with this is that you're a very proud democracy, very complicated society. At the same time, your reactions to our aspirations, our attempts to get this right, have been strategic, not tactical. And if you want to respond to everything we do or we don't do on a news cycle schedule, then you're obviously going to get into hot water because things are going to go up and down. And you obviously have no idea how democracies are developed, because that's not how democracies are developed. Democracies are developed through rule of law and political expression and lessons learned by people involved. I've witnessed that Indians have been very strategic in their commentary about this, insisting, repeating, that as much as democracy is the goal, you need to get this done yourself, and to get it done yourself with the least degree of losses or harm to all those involved. Some of our Western friends have tended to sort of look at, okay, what's the event of the day? Most recently there was a debate about a law we just adopted regarding demonstrations. Let me just dwell on that for a second as an example, and then I'll go into where and then into foreign policy. Well, we adopted a law on demonstrations. The law does not prohibit demonstrations. Actually, demonstrations in Egypt are not by permission, but by notification, even according to this law. So you notify a certain number of days before the demonstration. The Minister of Interior has the right, if he has evidence that there is a threat to order, to object to notification. If he doesn't, it's automatic. If he objects, you can then take him to a quote-unquote fast-track court to try to renounce his opposition. We've heard criticism from some Western countries who actually have laws that prohibit demonstrations without permission. Does our law possibly differ from other laws in some aspects in terms of how many numbers constitute demonstration, how far away you have to be from a building, possible penalties and so on? Of course it does. Could we have done it better? I'm sure we could have done it better. But it's not the beginning or the end of this whole process. This is just one step in a much larger issue. At a time when we're going through a constitutional debate, which is much more fundamental, to sort of focus on whether the law allows for a certain number of people to demonstrate or not, I mean, it shows you how people are looking at the tactics of the pettiness of this debate. And I will tell you openly, I am sure not all of our laws are done to the best advantage, nor will the future ones. We are going to be human efforts, and we will make mistakes and have our successes at the same time. But if you look at what is the core issue? The core issue is the Constitution. Now, where are we going? By the end of summer, we will hopefully have finished creating democratic institutions. Summer 2014. And we will then have to exercise, go through the political exercises using those constitutions and the complementary laws. We will have to start learning not how to agree with each other. We've always understood how to agree with each other. It's how to disagree with each other. What happens when you disagree, not when you agree? We will all have to learn that when you're in power, it doesn't give you more rights than those in the minority. It gives you more power than those in the minority. It doesn't give you more rights. And those in the minority have to understand that when you're in the minority, it doesn't give you less rights. It just gives you less power. And that's the way the system works. system of government in democracy has to be that of rule of law. And therefore, the mistake we made the first time in 2011 was not doing the Constitution first, which sets the rules of the game before getting into the political process. I am confident that once we get the institutions of government standing, we will succeed in developing a mature democracy at a much quicker pace than it normally takes because, first of all, we've been so late, and democracy now is the prevailing norm in the international community. But it's not going to be easy even to get to next summer, nor will it be easy to get through the first testing period, which is the first election cycle before 4 or 5 years after that. And the reason it won't be easy is there still is not frequent, there are frequent demonstrations, that's not the problem. But there is infrequent but serious use of force, of violence. Sinai, we have very serious terrorist problems. And every now and then, it also goes into the Delta and the rest of Egypt. That cannot be condoned. Political expression, even political expression that I completely disagree with, that is completely false, is still legitimate, as long as it is not violent, and as long as it is consistent with democracy. Democracy, don't misunderstand me, I don't mean that I have to agree with it. What I mean is that it has to be inclusive politically, not exclusive politically. If you believe you have the absolute answer, and nobody else has the right to another answer, then you cannot function in a democracy. If your ideology is based on, it's either my way, and if you don't agree with me, you don't have a role, then you cannot be part of a democracy. So I'm all for including everyone in Egypt, even those I will always disagree with, in the political system of the future, provided that they are peaceful, and provided that they accept that there will be another opinion in the country that will be different from their own. And that's really what was the challenge this last year. It's not going to be easy, but don't, again, on this 3 W's, don't simplify it too much. It's not true that all the secularists are like me, nor is it true that all the Islamists are Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of variations in this discussion. The only thing that's true is that they're all Egyptian. And that's really the challenge. We need to find how we operate together in this time. I am confident by the force of the youth, who are much more global than I was at their age, by the force of freedom of information, which forces you to deal with reality even if you deny it over and over again until you finally realize what is right and what is wrong. And by the force of international norms. We will never have the same democracy as in India, nor will you have that as in Sweden, or so on and so forth. But basic tenets of democracy, that of transparency, accountability, checks and balances, they have to be respected, irrespective of what kind of system we put together. This year will be a challenge, because we need to do reconciliation, economics, security, and institution building all at the same time. And then the next 4 years, the first election cycle, will be the testing ground. Do we do this right? And we will correct it as we go along, but we need to have the foundation. Now, how does all of this affect regional and foreign politics? Teachers love to say that we're the mother of the world. Well, I'm not sure what the actual empirical evidence is of that. I'm happy to say it, even as an academic, and you have to prove me wrong, so there's no evidence that I'm wrong either. So if it's just by way of longevity, we have some argument to say that's true. We've been around for 7,000 years. So every time I look at two of my Indian friends in the room, I won't name them to embarrass them, I think of my arms control background. And I remember a discussion with one of my Israeli colleagues. He said the problem is that they, the Israelis, always take into account worst-case scenarios. You guys never think of worst-case scenarios. That's a function that we've been there. It's a bad day today, we'll be there tomorrow. That's how we function. Now, that being said, if you have a state that has been around for so long and is distracted or not playing its full role, then you have a vacuum in the region. And frankly, there's been a vacuum in the Middle East because of our problems over years past and our distractions over the last 2 years, and I promise you it won't continue. You may disagree, you may agree with us, but we intend to play an active role, not because I'm the foreign minister, but because, frankly, whoever sits in this position, they're going to be held accountable by the Egyptian people in a much more efficient, effective fashion, and on a much shorter leash. They not only want to play a role in determining their domestic future, they also want to know why we've succeeded in this or why we haven't succeeded in this. And our challenge will be not to be drawn into pursuing foreign policy based on the news cycle, as most democracies have tended to do, frankly. So we have a vacuum to fill, and we need to fill it not out of pride, but out of national responsibility to our own people. To do that, my objective this year, and again, when I say my, I mean the foreign minister, not my person, is to, on the one hand, continue to defend this people's revolution. On the other hand, to refocus Egyptian foreign policy, bring it back to its center of gravity, which is the Arab world in Africa. Deal with the priority issues from that perspective, our priority regional issues, and then the global ones, are everything from the Arab-Israeli conflict presently now, the issue in Syria, about Middle East security, Nile water issues, and I'm here talking about the political issues. I can add to them issues of terrorism, I can add to them economic issues as well. So we have to deal with these regional issues and priority issues. And how do you deal with, I was brought up and trained in a bipolar world. By the time I reached mid-career, it wasn't a bipolar world. There was no Soviet Union, actually. Well, a little bit older than mid-career. Anyway, now it's a multi-stakeholder situation, and in order to prepare for the future, we've established a new unit in the Foreign Ministry that is focusing on technology and innovation. Because how you define power in the future will be based on your knowledge, not only on your economic or military power. And as we deal with all of these issues, it's not going to be, okay, is it only America? And then when I went to Russia, I was asked, you mean you're taking America out of the ballgame and putting Russia in its place? And I kept emphasizing that no, we're adding Russia again to our package of relationships. So it's not in place of America, it's over and above America. Next week I'm going to China, so they're going to say I'm taking Russia out and putting China in. That's not the case either. But it is a determined, and this is a function of the revolution. It's a determined strategic direction that we will have freedom of choice. Independence in the modern world is not isolation. It's freedom of choice through multiple options. That means managing your relationship with more than one player at the same time, in a proper sense, so that you have the choice to choose the best bargain, whether it is financial, political, and that you leverage your relationships together. And I want to stop on this first point, and then I will move very quickly into some other issues and then close. Over and over again, I keep saying, and I will say this until I leave office, Egypt's national security is based on economic, political, military determinants. But the fundamental fourth component is the international order. We are a medium-sized state, very prominent in our own region and a little bit beyond the region. But we don't claim to be a superpower. We don't have global designs beyond a more equitable world order. So for Egypt to feel satisfied and fulfilled, we need to have an equitable, correct world order so I can lean back and say, international norms, international law is what I depend on in this case of conflict or this dispute or this or that. So it's very important for us to be a participant and a player in developing the future world order. And that's one of the reasons why I come here. Sure, I come here for nostalgic reasons and for my own personal interest in India. But we're looking for compatible partners who will agree and differ with us, but compatible partners to help contribute in developing a more equitable international order. And if I may say, and I don't want to go beyond my, well, I normally do anyway, but I think both Egypt and India, given the depth of their civilizations and their historic roles, have a responsibility to do that, much more than other states. So part of what we will be focusing on is how do we develop political systems to affect the international world order over and above what we do regionally and domestically and regionally. The last point, and I won't labor this too much, the last point on these three parameters is I'm trying to hand over the foreign ministry in a better state to the next minister than the one I took it, not because the foreign minister was bad, he was an excellent guy and a very good friend of mine, but because for years we did not, in my mind at least, try to develop strategic thinking properly. Therefore, we're preparing different scenarios of what the world will look like in the future. On that basis, trying to determine our national goals, and on the visions and the goals, determining our policies, not the other way around. Now, if we're 70% right, it's still better than not having a vision. So I don't claim that we have to have exactly the right option. But we're trying to do that, and again, if I'm trying to develop a vision for the future, not only what it will be like, what I'd like to work towards it becoming. I need countries like India, who have both the moral and political weight, and I leave aside the economic issues, to work together on. Now, I can spend an hour on the Syrian issue, an hour on the Arab-Israeli conflict, an hour on the Iran nuclear deal. I'm happy to address all of those, but I prefer, frankly, just to stop where I am. Ask me any question you want. Believe me, I'm not going to be embarrassed. If I don't want to answer it, I won't, and I'll find a way not to. But I tend to answer most of the questions, and I'm very thick-skinned. So the only problem you will have is if you want to be really provocative in the question, you have to accept a provocative answer. If you're ready to do that, I'm all in. Thank you very much.